Welcome, everybody. It's July 12th, back for another Node Operator Roundtable. There we go. I'll hand it over to Brian.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, good afternoon, good night is my new greeting these days because of the global nature of node operators and crazy people who join this call at midnight or things of that nature. But to kick this off, I'll give a quick update on a Leap upgrade, and then we'll do some topic gathering to see what the main focus of today's call will be. So for today, which is July 12th, we will be pushing live a set of releases. So this is, oh gosh, help me with the version numbers, Eric. What are the version numbers that are going live?
We have 4.04. It's still early for me. And let me get the other ones. We have 3.15. Skipping around. And then 3.24. 4.04, 3.24, and 3.15.
Yeah. Now, so these releases all contain a fix for a security vulnerability, and so we do suggest that security vulnerability affects all nodes. So we do suggest that all node operators of any kind, whether you're a block producer or running API nodes or state history nodes or whatever, do upgrade to these versions at their earliest possibility. In addition to a fix for a vulnerability, there are other backported bug fixes in those, and of course the release notes on GitHub in the Antelope Leap repository go into detail on what those different fixes are. So you're getting some stability fixes and a critical vulnerability fix as well. So upgrade today. With that update, we can move into the topic building. I have a topic, but it's not super urgent. So before I even mention my topic, I'd love to see what other folks would like to cover.
I had a topic, not sure how related it might be to this group, but I think it's a good place to put it out there. We have on the Wharf weekly calls, Greymass is planning to put effort into a feature they call request for permission. And that will allow Wharf, which is meant to replace EOS among UAL and other things. It will allow it to create a private key locally in the front end or back end, wherever Wharf is being used, and then request from Anchor or other wallets that will implement that feature to create a new permission for the user. Of course, he needs to accept it and assign that permission to different actions in different contracts. And that would allow like dApps, especially games, to have a seamless experience when they're playing a game. So say you have a game and you need to do a lot of actions. When you're playing a game, you don't want to get out of the immersion. So if you have to click a button and then you're out into Anchor, it's an issue. So how can this be tackled leveraging Antelope features is this request for custom permission. Now, one thing I was thinking about is this can all be implemented without any changes, of course, to NodeOS or Leap. But I do have a feature request, if it's possible, to do in a timely manner, of course, for maybe 5.0, is to add an expiry option for permissions. Kind of how we have the wait option, but kind of the opposite. So that way, the UI, for example, can request like, okay, for the next hour, or create a new permission that lasts for this hour and allows me to do these specific actions in the browser, or at least basically because the browser at that point would have created the private key and can sign everything locally in the browser without ever exiting. And this is especially useful as well for mobile, because in mobile, you completely remove immersion by having to exit and go sign on the wallet and so on and so forth.
Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Interestingly, this has been a topic in different ways, shapes, and forms for quite a number of years. There was going back in history, there's there was the proposal for, I forget what it was called, but the manifest specification, and that we also did some internal exploration around how to handle some of these things. And there's actually a couple of different approaches to this. And I think that, so first of all, let me just say I'm very supportive of the idea of creating a user-friendly way for actions to be able to get approved without user intervention in clearly defined and scoped ways, right? Like that's definitely a good feature for the reasons that you mentioned, like, for example,
and just to clarify, there will be still user intervention, at least in the use case I'm saying, but there will be no user interaction with the wallet itself, so to speak.
Right, it would be upfront user intervention rather than each transaction, right?
Exactly. And every other transaction, like, in a game, they're going to be clicking a button, for example, like, go do this with your character. They still are going to initiate the action, but of course, at that point, it's being signed by the front end itself, and there's no back and forth.
I think of the analogy of OAuth. I can't remember what part of the sort of handshake dance this is, but where you're specifically requesting specific permissions in, like, when you're first connecting with an app, right? Like, like that, it's a flow that's familiar to users, and makes a lot of sense. What I wanted to mention is, we could definitely have some discussion on the expiry option. I think there are some folks who are not on the call today who have had some concerns about that I probably won't represent well, but just know that some of the core developers have discussed this, and there are some concerns around implementing an expiry option. But it is an option that we have considered and potentially could roll with. Some competing options that have also been discussed around this are implementing a standard for off-chain authorizations. What I mean by that is, obviously the authorization itself would occur on-chain, but the idea is, instead of it being a key per se, and you just sign directly, and what the permission is stored on-chain, there's effectively you sign, we'll call it a receipt, right? A token, perhaps, to use OAuth type metaphor, that specifies what the holder of that token should be able to do, right? And so then when you do a transaction, when the third party does a transaction, they sign it and provide that token, and therefore the two things are sort of evaluated together to say, oh, okay, yeah, they do have permission. And that solves the expiry issue, because the token itself could say, I want them to be able to do these things, but only until X time, right? That sort of thing. Another competing possibility was the idea of handling this through new smart contract features. This is another one that I'm not going to represent well, but the concept being that you could delegate certain permissions to a smart contract that implements more sophisticated sort of permission granting features and whatnot. And then a variation on that that's even more specific that we've discussed is baking some of these things into like a token standard proposal or something like that. So in other words, the token standard itself, let's say, for example, it's like, for crypto tokens, right? So we're talking about balances and things like that, right? But you could apply the same concept to things that aren't crypto tokens, like, NFT contracts or, things of that nature. So going back to the cryptocurrency token sort of standard, you can imagine the contract itself being smart enough to allow you to set very detailed application specific permissions, like, well, I want this sort of sub wallet, if you will, to only be able to be withdrawn by this account, and I only want it to be withdrawn at a rate of, X tokens per period, whatever period means, right? Et cetera, right? So in other words, moving to implementing standards for the most commonly needed use cases that are more application specific in nature. And of course, none of these things are necessarily mutually exclusive concepts. So like the answer might be some combination of those things.
And I think they serve a bit of a different purpose. There's some overlap for sure, but they might serve a different purpose, like having the smart contract do it versus what we're trying to achieve with this feature is effectively safer whitelisting. Yeah. As in, in Scatter, you had whitelisting before. Yeah, but this is more of like, and at the wallet level, of course, you can go as granular as you want. So if you add like whitelisting in a wallet, you can, set conditions based on the field types and ranges and whatever you want, and just verify the code hash, for example. But I think having an ability to do it through permissions, where now the onus of work is not on the dApp developer. The dApp developer can continue building all their, because a complicated game, you're going to have a ton of contracts. So instead of them having to retrofit this with some custom logic where if something goes wrong there, there's serious consequences. I think having that request for permission idea, assuming it works, also has a use case.
Yep, agreed. I actually years ago designed a workflow for, what did we call it? Well, anyway, but it was this basic concept of for the EOS network of requesting certain permissions sort of in advance. Now, I do want to also share just a principle that has come up in conversations before that I agree with. That is, I'm going to share it through telling a brief story. Back in this must have been like 2013 or something like that. I submitted call it a feature request, right? It's like a proposal to W3C. And I clearly engaged one of the, I don't remember what they call them, but the people who like oversee that portion of the specs and like sort of core contributors to the specs. Anyway, I clearly engaged his inner geek because we actually went back and forth on it for a little bit and like came up with a cool way that it could work. And then he like turned on his specification management hat, right? And said, okay, this is cool, but we're not going to implement it. And the reason is because just as a principle for a standard, you need to be like guarded about what features you implement until you see how people have implemented it in the wild without it being baked into the standard itself, like through workarounds, right? As a general premise, right? Where I'm going with that is I do wonder if like the first step, like I am supportive of this concept, but I do wonder if the first step that might make more sense is for trusted wallets to implement this in the wallet logic rather than in the system, so that we can see how they approach it and what problems they run into before building a protocol feature around it, right? Well, I guess it's not a protocol feature, but before building a
Making changes to the code.
Yeah, right.
No, I agree. And actually, part of that is we are going to move forward with the request for permission feature, and that would
even expiry. Yeah, even expiry could put it, like if this were to be sort of a drafted as a proposal or something, I could see it being documented as, like wallet should, as part of the request for permission, like should require that the requester also requests a sort of time period, like how long it's going to last. And, wallet should remove the permission.
But at that point, there's no control for, like the wallet may lose connection with the front end, and then you have no way to change that, unless you're saying when you're doing the request for permission, as the user signs it, it almost does like a scheduled transaction, but no scheduled transaction, like just keeps it in its own, I guess, wallet memory, and then goes and automatically removes that permission. Of course, the issue with that is if somebody just closes their wallet, or it's on another, like it's on your phone, and maybe it can't do anything while it's not in focus. But that's something to explore. But definitely we can build the initial part of it and prove the concept and show the improvement in user experience for Gamify, which I believe is one of the focuses of the ENF, and then might warrant a better discussion on what a solution might look like.
And I heard a underlying, more generalized potential feature request too, which obviously has its own can of worms, but around transaction scheduling features and whatnot. Because that could be pretty powerful, but falls into the same category of like, it'd be good to see.
Because it's not guaranteed. So that's the big issue with it. Yeah.
Yep. So that's one issue with that specific feature. The more general easy to see issue with expiring permissions and something like scheduled transactions is that they would come with a RAM cost, right? Like that for whatever period this need to live on there, that they would be taking up RAM. And then depending on how it's implemented, do those, for example, expiring permissions, like do they actually disappear from RAM, or are they just kind of sitting there as dead permissions?
Well, they definitely won't disappear on their own, like nothing on blockchain will happen and so on. But the user can either request that to remove it, or they can just next time they do a request for permission, the wallet itself can clear that, do whatever action is necessary to remove that RAM use.
And I think request for permission is a great example of seeing that implemented first. Like that might automatically not automatically. That might ultimately, that's what I meant to say, actually make sense as a core feature. Like obviously it would need to be presented through a wallet, but actually part of Leap in some way. But it's something that would be like a bad idea to implement now, because we haven't seen the pitfalls people are going to run into with it. Because the obvious risk I see there is around sort of deceptive permission requests, which is to say, burying the lead, right? Like, oh yeah, we're requesting permission to, I don't know, do this innocuous
Change your
thing,
permission.
this innocuous thing, and this innocuous thing, and then like down somewhere, it's like this not innocuous, And
Currently, the WARF is set to only allow it for non-USIO contracts, as well as the WARF implementation. But obviously, that doesn't limit it to non-USIO token contracts that still hold value. So the user still has to know what they're doing.
Right.
And on top of that, you kind of have to trust the DApp to a certain degree, because the front end could just be, taking that private key and, pushing it somewhere. Although the idea is, of course, we're talking about like, this is going to be living, assuming the DApp is not compromised. This is living on the user's browser. So the only way to take it is if he has malware or, and then he has probably bigger issues. But the idea is to use it for not important, obviously, people will do whatever they want, but the idea is to use it for not important actions where, say you're in a game, you're just doing actions in the game. So worst case, if somebody gains physical access or finds another way, they're just, kind of messing with your gameplay versus messing with tokens.
Right. To that, and to another concept that's like, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost too simple, right? That has come up before. And there's a caveat with this, which is goes right back to that RAM concern. But another concept is, what if wallets made it? This would require some leap features too, I think. But what if wallets made it easy to just have entirely separate sandboxed accounts for every app that you interact with, right? And then also had easy user experiences for like explicitly transferring between those different apps, right? Like, because then now it's like, well, there is no risk, right? Like they can only do whatever you've explicitly given them access to by like, transferring stuff into that account, right? And so now you don't necessarily need like a sophisticated permission system as much as you just need to be like cognizant of like, okay, I've transferred. If you can almost think of it like in Web 2 sort of way, which is like, oh yeah, like I trust, I'm gonna make it financial. I trust Bank A with my life savings. There's this other financial institution that seems kind of shady, but they have like 1,000% daily yield or something. So I'm gonna put a little in there to see how it goes and to take advantage of that yield, but I'm not gonna put all of my assets there, right?
But I think people already have that option. Like people, when they were using scatter and whitelisting, they used to do that, right? They used to just create another account with minimal funds and enable whitelisting on all actions. The issue is, I think it creates more RAM, like.
Yeah, so I think the problem is, I think it potentially could be a good experience, but there's some fundamental problems that would have to be solved for it to be an option, right? One, there's the technology sort of side problem, which is, yeah, it takes RAM, right? Like, and everybody having lots of accounts.
It's not easier for the user experience. You don't want to log, like, I don't know if you tried logging into Anchor, like we have a lot of testnets. Try logging into Anchor with like hundreds of users or accounts. And
well, so that's where I was going. The next piece of this is that I think all of that would need to be abstracted, right? The user would think of it as like a single account, and they wouldn't need to know the details of how things are sandboxed, but they would just understand that apps only have access to what they explicitly give them access to. through that. So an example of this is again, going back to like sort of a OAuth sign-in thing, right? When you log into an app with like your Facebook account or your Google account or whatever, right? You understand that one, you only have one Google account, right? So that feels easy. But two, the app you're logging into is not your Google account, right? And so it's a known kind of metaphor.
Yeah, like social login is just going to use your token to verify that you are that email, but then you're going to obviously have your own database where you're associating that email address with the own data that you want to keep. But for the user experience, it's one account. Even in a game or a blockchain, you want that one account because that one account might be linked to maybe NFTs that can be used in the game. They might be linked to tokens on another contract, and not necessarily everything you want separated. What you want is the permission separated, but not the account. So I think the solution might have to do with either working the permission system, if it even needs to, or potentially even have another smart contract that's generic and can be used for the game to that has like anybody can add the public key so it can sign on their behalf some things. Like there might be something that could be done as before changing the permission system to do it on a separate contract.
Yeah.
And potentially try it that way.
The point of debate that like a kind of rebuttal to that is like, I think you're totally right sometimes. And then in other use cases, it's not that way. Because as an example of that, right? Like, yes, interoperability and stuff, I would want apps to, be able to interoperate in good ways. But by contrast, I would not want to use my, for example, bank account to play a shady web game, right? Like, or even something like my Google account, which I used to log in all over the place, right? I wouldn't want any random app that I'm logging in with my Google account to be able to do anything with my Google data, right? Now that
can do anything, but you can do anything with your account that they use the Google account to generate. And in this case, with permissions, you would effectively have the same thing where, sure, with that permission, they can do anything in that game ecosystem, but they can't do anything outside it.
That's actually where I was going with this. Is I actually think these are not mutually exclusive concepts. They are compatible, complementary concepts, because in some cases you want to grant an app permission to do things, specific things, on your behalf with your, like, in this metaphor, with your Google account, right? But you also, the app needs its own sort of sandbox, right? Where it can do its own stuff, right? And so I could see these as potentially compatible concepts, where it's like, yes, you have the ability to request permissions in a very OAuth style, and now that game can, on your behalf, do certain things, right? But also the game does have, with that game, you do have some kind of sandbox, whether it's a separate account or, some kind of namespacing within an account. I'm imagining a blank slate right now so that I don't have to deal with the complexities of reality. But anyway, yeah. So I think this is just backing up a little. The concept makes sense. Supportive of the need. Would like to, discuss it further, and I'll actually reach out to Aaron on this as well to get a pulse on where they are with this and talk through some potential ways forward. But also I just wanted to convey that there are some alternative approaches that aren't necessarily in competition with it. Like some could be complementary, but also could be in competition in terms of priority, right? Like because they solve some overlapping problems, but in different ways, right? So.
No, that's great. I just wanted to put it out in the forefront so
Yeah,
people
I
can
appreciate
potentially think about it.
It was a good one-on-one discussion. I want to invite anybody else if they have any thoughts or input on that discussion before seeing if there are other topics we should go into. All right. Did anybody else have a topic they wanted to discuss? All right, I've got two. If anybody else, I'll pause after my first one to ask again to see if anybody else has topics, and then I'll dive into my second. So the first is just kind of a non-update on 5.0 stuff. So I have a meeting today to dig into some of the timelines around instant finality, which is really kind of the keystone feature for 5.0 as we're targeting it today. And part of the purpose of that meeting is to figure out the way forward to get a clear ETA on when 5.0's first release candidate could be ready. So that's kind of where we are. The other potential release blocking feature that we're working on is internally we call it chicken dance. It's the purpose of it is to gain confidence that consensus has not been broken. It's particularly important for releases like 5.0 that have protocol upgrades that are more likely to potentially break consensus, right? And so we're working on that as well. It's in some solution design stages, and so all of that has to happen before we can estimate timelines there. So that's the non-update is still working on figuring out the timeline when a release candidate can be ready for 5.0. But I wanted to bring it up because I think the nature of this call is about to temporarily change coming soon. It'll go back to a more of a, Leap 3.1, win upgrade type of thing, probably more run by Daniel than myself. If he's open to it, we need to discuss that, Daniel. And, it'll be more about coordinating a consensus sort of protocol upgrade. So that's coming. I just want people to, I don't think it's like immediate future, but coming soon. The purpose of this call will sort of temporarily change in nature. And then once we get through that process, we'll come back to more of a topical discussion format like this. Before I move to the next potential topic, did anybody else want to raise any topics that they want to discuss? Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was moving around whenever you were asking about the questions. But if you're talking about the linking of permissions, that prevents the active key to sign. So I would think that could potentially cause an issue, especially if there was a temporal aspect to that. And then I did share sort of like a solution that I was talking about, which you mentioned as well. Perhaps I'm misunderstanding, and you're talking more about like the whitelisting compared to the linking of account permissions. So I wanted to sort of get a little bit of clarity on that, as well as what exactly would be the implications for that temporal aspect of permissions.
So with the expiring key, I wonder if Shaq might actually know more about the sort of the requested feature. I think the idea that there would actually be a totally separate key that would be added added to permissions, like whitelisted, right?
Exactly. Like a key would be generated on WRF running on the front end, and that public key of it will be passed to create a new permission for a specific contract/action. And that's feasible in theory now, but the question was more if we can have an expiry option opposite to the kind of wait permission, where you can have a permission that has an expiry. So every time somebody tries to use that permission, that expiry field is checked and only allows it off if that expiry is met as part of, 2 out of 2, say, authorized, like how the wait was, so you have an expiry that needs to be met, like that the transaction is happening before that, as well as the key needs to work, and that key being coming from the front end. And of course, whitelisting, like you mentioned, is different than creating permissions and linking them. This is more to effectively get something similar to whitelisting for a temporary session in a game or in a testnet.
Okay, I guess then my concern that I wanted to raise is the implications with third-party applications. For example, I'm using custom permissions in my applications to mint NFTs. And one of the reasons I do that is because I don't want to ever put an ENV file with permissions that would give owner or even active keys to somebody who could potentially hack my Amazon or whatever account. So in that case, I've come across, like, if I try to go to Simple Market was the dApp that I ran into this issue, it would automatically try to sign with the active key, even though I was logged in under a different key. And that was a problem within their UI. So that's, maybe that's not a valid concern, but it seems like if you are linking permissions, especially if it's a non-project token, especially if it's something like atomic assets, which could be a common use case of such a thing, you may run into inter-dApp issues. So that was all I wanted to sort of raise.
I'll jump on this just very quickly. That would be definitely a UI issue. I've seen similar, not the same, but similar issues in Anchor, for example, where if you have a co-signed transaction and it's both like co-signers have the same key, it will try to get you to sign with the wrong account/permission. Obviously, the UI, and when you log in, you're not logging into an account, you're logging into an account at permission, and that should be honored by the wallet.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Thank you.
It occurs to me, going back to this thought of like the wallet implementing the expiry, sort of that concept as a first step. I mean, it occurs to me that the wallet, obviously you trust your wallet because your keys are stored there, right? So perhaps the wallet, what am I trying to say? Rather than
the wallets can can automatically expire based on, like, the add request, for example, to the wallet can also have an expiry that the wallet saves itself and automatically executes a transaction.
Well, no. So that's one way of doing it. So a variation on this idea, right? So let's go to the way it works today, right? The app itself doesn't store the key, right? The wallet stores the key. And so then the app, when it wants a signature, it asks the wallet, hey, sign this. And then the wallet asks the user, hey, do you want to sign this, right? And then the user either approves or rejects, right? So and maybe I'm not understanding the proposal, but instead of when you do a request for permission, right? Instead of the app getting a key and signing itself, could it still ask the wallet to sign the thing, right? And if there's a granted permission, the wallet, instead of asking the user to sign, simply signs it, right? Just as if it had asked the user to sign it, right?
This is effectively what Scatter had in terms of whitelisting.
Right, exactly. So, but if it worked that way, then that also means that the expiry would be, a trivial extra piece of functionality, because it when it receives a request to sign, it would go, oh yeah, I don't have an unexpired permission, so I'm not going to sign that for you, right? I think that would solve most of the use cases of like having an unobtrusive sort of flow. It would not solve the situation of like, well, what if the app wants to do something, like in the middle of the night when it doesn't have access to the user's wallet?
No, but that's a different use case. I'd like to kind of keep them separate a bit, because one thing it doesn't solve, the solution, is on mobile. So if you're playing a game on your tablet, like unless you're going to use a central server that is receiving those requests, and that server has keys, which is obviously a no-no in Anchor or something, you're still stuck where you can't, to communicate back, you kind of can't. So that's why like Aaron came up with the idea for request for permission to allow that even on their mobile wallet, which I think is a good way, even without the expiry, because the expiry, like you said, can be handled in many ways. Like you can even potentially, just warn the user when he logs out from your dApp, like give him an option to, remove that permission, or have the wallet itself track and show you like, hey, you have here permissions that expired, but you still didn't remove that from the chain. And I was thinking of this more as a temporary solution, and to see if it does really improve the UX and we can eventually have expiry on chain. I think that might be a path to get it on chain by first proving out the concept and showing the need for it.
Right. Just to be clear, I'm curious about the intended implementation. Is the idea that when you request that permission and it is granted, that that the app has the private key for that permission?
Yes. So here for app, we're gonna say front end, just to kind of make sure it's not the smart contract. And the front end will, before it requests a permission, part of that request is gonna be the public key that is gonna be associated with the private key that gets generated on the front end by WARF in the UI. So it will generate a new unique private key. And part of that request for permission, it will pass the contract names, actions, as well as that public key associated to be used by Anchor to create that permission once the user approves it.
Right. Yeah. So, and I see the advantages of that, but I also see the risks, right? Because once they actually have the key directly and aren't having to flow through some trusted service, then control has been lost, right?
Sure, but control has been added. I wouldn't say lost. There's control that's been added to the front end, limited control. That is also, obviously, the UI will have access to it if it's malicious, but it's a limited control. It doesn't have, and by default, as we said, like it won't allow for any EOSIO actions. So,
and it's already possible to add custom permissions today. So we're not adding any new risks. We're adding the added ability to have that permission expire. Like, for example, EOS name service we're getting ready to relaunch, we will likely be adding a request in order. So what EOS name service does is it allows you to resell your premium names. So I, for example, I bought the Inc. name on the EOS name auction. I can resell Daniel.Inc. But to do that on a marketplace like we're doing, the smart contract needs permission to sell names using your premium name. So we're going to be having people add a custom permission that gives our smart contract the permission to sell names on your behalf. And that's the only thing it has permission to do. So this feature shack is requesting would allow the user to say, well, you only have permission for X period of time to sell names on my behalf, as opposed to in perpetuity.
Right.
But I'm wondering, is it? I don't know if the can a permission remove itself, or do you always need an owner key to add or remove any permission? And if it is possible for a permission to remove itself, you could have one of the permissions it has access to is to remove itself, and the smart contract, has.
I think only a parent permission can do that. Not necessarily.
Parent, and it'd probably be linked to the update on action, not so much update self. And you can do it through a contract, maybe.
And also, let's distinguish, because we don't need to remove things automatically, because that's like that's not what that's not how you're gonna necessarily do things on the blockchain. You want it so that the next request or next time, it can check what it expired and then remove them. So I'm not concerned with necessarily removing the permission right away, but if it has an expiry where the permission requires 2 out of 2 of these conditions to be met, one of which is the key, and the other one is, as I said, the equivalent to wait, but an expiry. And that way, nobody can use the permission after expiry, and you can go delete it at any time, which can be obviously enhanced using UIs or the wallet itself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good discussion. I also am curious to do some research into the thoughts that the core developers have explored around this too, because there's likely been some in-depth conversation on this that I'm not privy to. I'll see if I can sort of report back with some of those thinkings as well. But and also, I think it would be appropriate to inject this conversation into those WRF calls. So, which obviously is where it came from in the first place. But yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Okay, we're about at time, so I'm gonna try to figure out the quickest possible way to get at what I'm after for this. So the larger topic, which we won't get into today because it would take too long, is understanding sort of your dream install and upgrade processes for NodeOS as a longer range change to make staying current much more trivial, right? As the ultimate solution might not even involve this at all, but it's just as something that we could discuss quickly right now. Curious about like the various package managers that people use and the preferred package and configuration management.
As in like apt, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I guess if you're on Debian or Debian based like Ubuntu, you're typically just using apt, I would imagine, and the equivalent on Red Hat, Yum and stuff.
Mm-hmm. We personally run multiple instances, so we hard code individual binary paths, so it wouldn't be as fruitful, so to say, for us.
Yeah. And how about on the terminology is escaping me right now, but what are they called? The tools that let you run these sorts of configuration updates across lots of servers are called
Ansible scripts.
Yeah, that's an example of the type.
This one, yeah.
Yeah, deployment methods. I mean, I mean, Nations, I know, has a crazy big process that they use. Detroit, I think, is who wrote some big Ansible, whatever. It's not that's not my thing, so I can't speak too much on it. But I mean, there are some automated deployments. It really comes down to what chain, what features, and then being able to, retrieve like Nations.
And your specific configuration for each.
Well, that's what I was going to say. The reason they wrote the validator that they have is to automatically go out and fetch peers and stuff like that to build into their config, which is driven, is it the state history, turn on state history, things like that. So a lot of that's been started to be discussed, when we start identifying the different roles. And that's kind of around what a lot of those deployment methods, here's all your different types that you're deploying. And then obviously your deployment method tended to, oh, it's a ship node, turn this on, turn these extra parameters on. Oh, it's EOS. Okay. It's a vanilla binary. Oh, it's WAX. It's got to be this other binary. And then obviously things respective to it. But it basically dynamically builds that config.
I think build tools in general are specific to the infrastructure generally. Different people are going to use different things. A lot of people are going to script their own things using system services or other things. So I think maybe the effort, if we want to improve that, could be more in the stuff Michael mentioned earlier, which is regardless of the configuration that you set, there is some things that NodeOS handles itself. Like if you're restoring from snapshot, delete the state and remove the reversible. If you have a ship node, to remove disable replay or automatically disable replay. A few of those things will make it easier for people to make their own development or deployment tools work for them.
I agree. Auto peer discovery is another big one because that's where you got to kind of go out and figure out who you can sync with. And that's why I say that documentation, and I even talked about it yesterday on a call. There was a BP Ask Me Anything thing that there's not really much documentation about all these different nuances and quirks, but a substantial effort's being made to identify them and at least provide like that documentation. That's what's going to be the Bible, so to say, for Nations to know I need to do this, 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 and this. Detroit to say, well, I do the same things. I just do it via Ansible. But to give them the recipe for whatever tools you want, like Amsterdam, I forget what they use, Signia or whatever it is. Here's what you need to do. Do it however the hell you want to do it. Oh, it's like NodeOS. Here's what you need to run it. Run it as a system service, run it as in a container, whatever the hell you want to do. But these are the expectations and the playbook, because that's where, they can read. There's just not much to read, and it's so archaic and so many different parameters, especially now.
I have to agree that that should be the focus of documentation, because everyone's IT infrastructure layout is going to be different, and everyone ideally should be using infrastructure as code to handle their own configurations, and dynamically make changes for themselves.
Yeah, we just typically set like a standard config for the role, and then copy it. There are 3 of them. If it's an API, if it's a ship node, if it's a BP, whatever it is, we just maintain a static config, although it can dynamically build if I were scriptable. I do things hard.
All right. Well, we're over time. So, but that's, a good introduction to that. We'll come back to this topic in a future call, but Thank you for everyone for weighing in. Circling back to what I mentioned at the beginning, July 12th, 2023 is today, and we are pushing updated versions for both 3.1, 3.2, and 4.0 that fix a vulnerability and also include a number of backported bug fixes. So please, if you're running a node, upgrade as soon as possible. And with that, I'll hand it back to Daniel to close us out.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. Have an awesome day.